Architecture and Philosophy, a Retroactive Manifesto. What is the relationship between architecture and philosophy? Is there one? After all, architecture is a discourse of form, of building forms, of potential building forms. Meanwhile, philosophy is a discourse of ideas, of concepts, of arguments. They are quite distinct disciplines. They're quite different. So what is the connection between architecture and philosophy? Here I want to lay out two areas where the relationship is somewhat problematic. I want to look at how philosophers have engaged with architecture and then how architects have engaged with philosophy. Then finally, I want to explain where I think philosophy can have the greatest impact on architecture. Let us turn first then to the way in which philosophers have engaged with architecture. And there are several incidents where key thinkers have addressed buildings and architecture. But the problem is that philosophers tend to look at buildings and architecture in a different way to how architects look at them. For example, Michel Foucault looks at the panopticon, the design for a prison with a central tower and the cells arranged radially around them. He looks at this, but he doesn't look at this in terms of the architecture. He looks at the panopticon in terms of a diagram of how society operates. He sees it as an illustration of how society operates. Now, we architects are used to diagrams of buildings. We are not used to buildings becoming diagrams of how society operates. Frederick Jameson does something very similar with the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles. He uses this hotel to illustrate the homogenizing placelessness of late capitalist society. The fact that everybody gets lost in the atrium of the hotel, it becomes in some way a way of illustrating the lack of cognitive mapping, the lack of bearings that people have within the logic of late capitalism. But he's not talking about the architecture itself. Likewise, Deleuze and Guattari refer to the Gothic and the Romanesque in their discourse about the war machine. But they're not referring to the Gothic and the Romanesque as styles of architecture. They're referring to the Gothic and the Romanesque as ways of thinking, as logics of thinking. The Romanesque being based on a visual template, according to fixed laws and proportions, and the Gothic being an experimental exploration of how one might construct form in a very bottom-up way. Equally, we have someone like Jacques Derrida referring to deconstruction. What he means by deconstruction is not anything to do with architecture as such. He's deploying an architectural metaphor. Derrida's argument is that we should deconstruct not the forms of architecture, but our constructed ways of approaching architecture, our constructed ways of looking at the world itself. We therefore have to operate like an architect. We have to dismantle all those preconceptions, all the privileged hierarchies, all the distorted ways of looking at the world in order to dig down to a solid foundation from which we can then build an argument. Zimmel too refers to architectural elements. He writes about the bridge and the door. But he's not writing about the bridge and the door as architectural elements. He's using them to articulate the two different modes of thinking, connecting and separating categories. The bridge is that which connects two things that are separated, and the door is that which divides what is continuous. The bridge and the door, therefore, serve as illustrations of articulations of two different ways of thinking. But perhaps it's the bridge that offers us some indication of how we can engage with the world of philosophy. For Simmel, one cannot connect something unless it is first separated, and one cannot separate something unless it is originally connected. Can we therefore connect, build a link, build an interaction between architecture and philosophy? Architects, too, often look at philosophy. They are inspired by philosophy. They borrow from philosophy. They use philosophy. But architects often misunderstand philosophy. Architects tend to architecturalize everything they see or hear. They turn it into architectural form. But sometimes the concepts used by philosophers are not referring to architectural form at all. When Deleuze writes about the fold, he's not referring to folded form. He's not referring to pleated matter. He's actually referring to subjectivities, both human and non-human. He's referring to ways of thinking. And yet architects automatically somehow interpret the notion, the concept of the fold, as though it is some kind of architectural form. So too Derrida, when he uses the term deconstruction, he's not talking about architecture. He's using an architectural metaphor perhaps, but he's not talking about architecture itself. He's talking about the constructed way by which we look at the world. There is a danger then that architects misunderstand philosophy. They misunderstand philosophy and take concepts from philosophy and translate them into architectural forms. There's also a danger that architects will use philosophy as a way of adding a certain intellectual veneer to their project. It adds a certain depth, it adds a certain meaning, it adds a certain philosophical dimension. But philosophy is not a fashion accessory. Philosophy should not be used in this way. There is a danger then that architects misuse, misunderstand, and abuse philosophy. There is no such thing as a philosophy of architecture, or indeed an architecture of philosophy. Architecture is not built philosophy. What then is the relationship between architecture and philosophy? What is the role of philosophy, perhaps, in terms of the discourse of architecture? You must recognize there is no such thing as an architecture of philosophy, or indeed a philosophy of architecture, but there is a relationship, a potential relationship between architecture and philosophy. To my mind, we must recognize that architecture is itself a discourse about buildings. And as such, theory plays an important role in that discourse. And it is theory itself, that can be interrogated through philosophy. And that, to my mind, is where the potential of philosophy lies. Philosophy, as Gilles Deleuze has said, is exactly like a box of tools. Theory is like a box of tools. You can use those tools and deploy them. You can use them to challenge things, to open up, to prize open questions, to challenge the cozy hegemony of architectural thinking, to call it into question, not in order to destroy it, but rather to expose the weakness in the argument. When Frederick Jameson criticizes Kenneth Frampton and his use of critical regionalism, exposing the problems in the term, the complicity of the term within late capitalism itself, he's not doing this in order to destroy Frampton. He's doing this to point out the weakness in the argument. in order perhaps for Frampton to improve that argument, to make it make sense. Likewise, when Theodor Adorno criticizes Adolf Loos for the way in which he addresses the question of function in architecture, he's not doing that to destroy Adolf Loos. Rather, he's trying to expose the undialectical way with which he's approaching the question of functionalism. He's exposing a problem that can be addressed in some way. And that, to my mind, is the role of philosophy. Philosophy provides architectural theory with a set of tools, a set of useful tools, to question, to criticize, to problematize. And that's what the role of theory itself is. Theory should not be there to legitimize an architectural position. Theory is about questioning, challenging, trying to call into question received views in order to improve them. And that, to my mind, is the role of philosophy and the relationship between philosophy and architecture. As Derrida puts it, to go after architecture, not in order to attack, destroy, or deroot it, to criticize or disqualify it, rather in order to think it, in fact, to detach itself sufficiently to apprehend it in a thought which goes beyond the theorem and becomes a work in its turn. That perhaps is the role of philosophy. Philosophy and architecture, architecture and philosophy. We can bring ideas from philosophy, concepts from philosophy, add them to architecture, philosophy and architecture and philosophy, in order to improve architecture, in order to make architectural theory itself more rigorous. That, to my mind, is the role of philosophy.